Hi everyone. So as you know, this week is all about managing hard disks and maintaining our machine's hard disks and making sure that everything's working fine as far as storage goes. Um, so what I'm going to try to show in this video is all of the different built-in utilities Windows has available to you that allow you to manage your hard disks and configure them in different ways, and make sure that they're running as well as they can. So before you start this video, if you haven't read Chapter 3, go ahead and pause and then go ahead and read Chapter 3, because we're going to be covering just the utilities and we're not going to be going over the concepts that Chapter 3 will offer. So make sure that you've read that before watching this video. So if you have read Chapter 3, what we're going to do is we're going to cover disk management first, and disk management is a utility that we can use in Windows here to manage the different disks we've got. So we're going to be going over a few things that the disk management utility allows us to do. Then we're going to be going over the disk cleanup utility, and then we're going to be talking about the Microsoft Management Consoles. And then finally we're going to go over the command line interface, and then we're going to talk about the different disk-related commands that you can use to manage and maintain your hard drive or solid-state drive. So the first thing we're going to want to do, we said that we're going to talk about disk management first. So the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to locate disk management. So there's a couple of different ways we can do that. The easiest way, and this is true for just about any application in Windows, is to use the search feature. So the search feature is just accessible by clicking Start, and then we can see here on here we have the search program files, or excuse me, search all programs and files. And I'm just going to type disk management. And you can see here that we have the create and format hard disk partitions. That will take you straight to the disk management utility. So we're going to click that. And we're going to ignore this for just a second here. And then Microsoft really likes to include a whole bunch of different ways for you to access the same utility. The next easiest way to access it is to click Start and then right-click My Computer, or rather Computer, and then we're going to click Manage. Now this pops up a Microsoft Management Console called Computer Management, and that's what we're going to talk about here in this third section. Computer Management is basically just a collection of tools called snap-ins in Microsoft Management Console terms that allow us to manage the machine. So these are all useful tools that Microsoft has shown us that, or rather has given us here, or aggregated here, for us to use to manage, or to make it easy to manage the machines. You can see down here we have storage and then disk management, and that will take us directly to the exact same management utility that we opened just a few minutes ago. So I'm going to go ahead and close computer management, and then we're going to use just the disk management utility. Now there's no difference between using those two, other than the fact that the computer management utility, or the computer management MMC, allows us access to more features or more system tools, but we're going to cover that in a later chapter. So the first thing you'll see in disk management is we have some information about our C drive. Now, as you'll read, these drive letters are arbitrary, but they basically just explain, drive letters are basically just assigned to either a partition or a volume. And you'll read about partitions or volumes in Chapter 3. You can see here that it gives us some basic information about the properties of the disk. So for example, we can see here that the layout of the disk is simple and the type of disk is basic. So if this was a dynamic disk, you would see dynamic listed here, and then under layout you would either see simple volume, span volume, or striped volume. And again, you'll read about that in Chapter 3. So you'll also see the file system. You can see that this file system is formatted NTFS. Typically in Windows you'll see either NTFS or FAT32. NTFS is most common, but FAT32 is also something you'll see. You'll see that typically like on flash drives and external hard drives. The next column over here you'll see is status. And the status column here basically is exactly like it sounds. It explains the status of the drive. You'll notice that this column here mimics what is being shown down here. So those are one and the same. In general here, if you see anything other than healthy, there's something wrong with your machine and you need to take a look at it. Your book gives a really good overview of the different statuses that you'll see. So depending on what the status is, you might see like degraded or any number of other statuses. You'll be able to use your book and internet resources to diagnose kind of what those mean. Next, we can see here we have the capacity. This is the maximum amount of space you can use on your hard drive. So if you buy a hard drive or a solid-state disk drive, you'll see that typically that's the deciding factor aside from speed, is the capacity or how much data you can throw on it. So that's what this column right here is showing. And then over here you can see that this free space column is telling you how much space you have left on this column, and then this gives you a nice percentage of how much information, or rather how much space is left. So you can see here that it is a 90 gig hard drive. It has 5.23 gigabytes left, and it is 6% free. So that's a useful tip to see if maybe your hard drive's filled up. Just, I guess, a brief digression about hard drives. In the Windows world, you really don't want to use all the hard drive, especially for a system drive or a drive that's containing your operating system. Basically, what happens is it makes it really difficult for the operating system to operate, for lack of a better word. So if you don't have enough space, then what will happen is the machine will crawl to a halt and it won't fix itself until you clear up that space. So it's really important that you monitor the free space of your hard disk. We're going to be talking about performance monitoring in a later chapter. So that's one of the metrics that we'll measure in the performance monitoring chapter. You can also see here that this next column here is fault tolerance. So fault tolerance is basically if something bad were to happen to the hard drive, could it recover with your data intact? So you'll read about simple span and stripe dynamic disks. And you'll also read about RAID, or redundant arrays of independent disks. And those all, depending on how you set them up here in disk management, allow you to make the disks fault tolerant. So again, you'll read about that in chapter 3. I'm not going to go over those at this point in time, but if you have questions about how to make your disks fault tolerant, please post to the discussion board. Okay, so that was the first part of disk management. So let's kind of show off what we can do with it. So first off, we were looking at the disk properties. So you can see here that down in the bottom kind of scroll box here, we've got all of the different disks assigned to this machine. So these are the actual physical components that are hooked up to this particular machine. You can see here I have 3 hard disks: disk 0, disk 1, and disk 2. In the computer world, counts always start at 0. So typically the first thing in line is disk 1, the second thing will be disk 2, the first thing in line will be disk 0, the second thing in line will be disk 1, and so on and so forth. You can also see that we've got some CD-ROM drives attached to this machine, but we won't talk about those right now. So first off, let's see if we can view some of the properties of this volume here. So let's right click and then we'll select properties. So now you can see here that properties tab opens, and excuse me, and this will show us properties for this specific volume or this specific partition on this disk. So again, we can see here a lot of the same information that we saw in that kind of toolbar we looked at earlier, the view we looked at earlier. On this general tab, we have the name of the disk, which would go right here, and we could set that if we wanted to. So let's just set it to tests for now. We can see here a nice little pie graph of how much free space is left on our drive. We can click compress this drive to save some disk space, and what that will do is it will try to compress some of the files on the drive, or rather use some algorithms to make the amount of space that the data takes up on the drive less. We can also select this checkbox here, allow files on this drive to have contents indexed in addition to their file properties. And what that allows us to do is it allows us to use the search feature. We're going to go more into what indexing is a little bit later, but I just wanted to kind of show that off. So let's go ahead and we'll go over. Oh, let me back up. This is also a way you can access disk cleanup, and we're going to talk about that here in a bit. So tools. We've got an option for error checking, we've got an option for defragmenting, and we've got an option for backup. We're going to cover backups in a few weeks, so we won't go over that, but I wanted to show you where that's at. We're going to cover defragmentation in just a little bit in the further part of this video, and then we're going to talk about error checking a little bit later too. So let's talk about hardware. So this is actually showing all disk drives and not just this particular disk. So you can see here, this is where you would go to find information about your hard drive. So if you're trying to find like the manufacturer of your hard drive, or the model number of your hard drive, you can go to this hardware tab and it should show you. It doesn't show you all the time, but it usually does. The reason mine looks a little bit different is I'm running on a virtual machine. So you can see here that it says VMware Virtual S. That's just showing up because I'm using a virtual machine. If you're running on VirtualBox, you'll also probably see something very similar to this, and I'll explain in the lab how to go about finishing the lab with that information. If you want to delve down even further into this, so let's say we want to look, let's just pretend for this example that this is a Hitachi hard drive, and we want to see some more properties about it or some more information about it. We just select the disk in this list and we'll click properties, and then we can see some more information about this hard disk. So we've got this general tab, which tells us what type of device it is, who the manufacturer, and the location of the hard drive. This typically isn't important for client machines, so I'll leave that for now. It's really more important for server and stuff. It'll give you information about the device, so if it's working properly, it'll say this device is working properly. If it's not working properly, it'll give you an error code in here, which you can then put into Google or another search engine, and you can usually find what that error code means. Policies here, I typically like to leave this for checked as better performance. You'd only want to click quick removal if you were using like a flash drive or an external hard drive that you needed to unplug quickly. If you set it as quick removal, it disables write caching, which for you basically means you can disconnect the device without safely removing the hardware, but that means that you run the risk of corruption, and it's a little bit slower doing it this way too. So next here we'll see volumes. So again, we talked about the difference between volumes and partitions. If you have any volumes set up on this disk, you'll see it here, listed here. You'll see it listed here after you hit populate. That will pull out a lot of information for you. So this is a good place for you to look at. Driver. Now we kind of talked about what drivers were last week in chapter 1, but just as a refresh, drivers are basically just a set of instructions that are given to the operating system that basically tell it how to use the piece of hardware. I like to think of it like a manual that you would get like with your VCR, with you being the operating system and the VCR being the piece of hardware. The manual just basically explains to you how to use that VCR. It's exactly the same for drivers. The driver explains to the operating system how it should use that hardware. So here you have some control over what you can do with the driver. We're going to talk about drivers a little bit later in another lecture / lab. So I won't go over this too much right now. Detail. If you really want to see a lot of information about your hardware, you can look up the detail information here. So for example, if you want to see the display name, it'll show up there. There's a bunch of stuff here that I don't even really go into. It's really just a bunch of device flags for programmers. So if you're into programming, this is a really good tab for you. But if not, this is maybe not a tab that you look at all that often, but you should be aware that it exists. So I'm not going to go over each one of these options here, but basically they just give you some information that has to do with the particular hard drive you're looking at. Okay, so now we're going to click cancel on this, and that was just the hardware tab, so we're going to keep going. Sharing, if you want to share this whole hard drive or this whole volume over a network, you can share it using this sharing tab. We're going to cover networking a little bit later, again in another lecture, so this is where we would go to enable sharing, so just be aware of that. Security, if you want to apply specific, or if you want to set it up so specific users can access or can only access this hard drive, or if you want to deny specific users access to this hard drive, you can do that through the security tab. We're going to cover security again in another lecture, but this is how it goes. I sound like a broken record and I apologize, but there's a lot to the operating system and I don't have a whole lot of time, so I just want to get through this here and let you know where everything's at. Previous versions, this is where you would go to restore your disk to an earlier state. We're going to talk about backup and recovery a little bit later, but this is what's called shadow copy, and it allows you to restore or revert to an earlier point in time. So kind of useful if you get a virus or if you install an application that messes up your system, you can restore to a previous version really quickly this way. And then finally here, we have the quota tab. So if we want to enable quota management, and a quota is basically just telling the operating system how much disk space the user is allowed to use. So let's say for example, you got your kids on your machine and you want to set it up so that they only have access to write a certain amount of data to the hard drive at any given point in time. You can set up a disk quota here. So excuse me. So you can set up a disk quota here, and that will prevent them from writing a whole bunch of data to your hard drive. I found that really useful in the example I found that really useful in the case where you've got kids and the kids want to put a whole bunch of music onto your machine, and you don't really want to let them do that. You can enable a quota like this and prevent them from exceeding that quota. So we're going to cancel out of this. So that was looking at the properties of the volume here. You've also got some other options here. You notice if I right-clicked the disk properties rather than the volume properties, they were a little bit different. So the disk properties going there is exactly the same as right-clicking properties, and then going to hardware and then properties. So it's just and I'll go to the right one, so you can see it's just another easier, again like I said, Microsoft gives you a whole bunch of different ways to get to the exact same menu. It's just another way to get to that menu. So you've got a few options here as far as what you can do. If you want to create a new span, striped, or mirrored volume, you can do that by right-clicking the disk and then going through each one of these wizards. I'm not going to go through that at this point in time, just because I'm running out of time here, but this is how you would go and set up new volumes like that. You'll see here we have, it says new RAID 5 volume. This is an interesting, I guess I would almost call it an oversight in Windows 7. You can't actually set up a RAID 5 volume in Windows 7, but you can in the server operating system and like Windows Server 2008 and 2012. And my guess here is that what they've done is they left this option in because they had copied the user interface over from one operating system to the other. So they left this option here for server OSs, but they didn't remove it for the client OS. So you can't actually add RAID 5 volumes, but that option is still there. As far as I know, you have to have a hardware RAID controller or set up a RAID controller in the BIOS. And we're not going to talk too much about RAID in this video, but you should read your book and go look at what RAID is. So let's see, what else can we do? If you want to convert the disk to a dynamic disk, you can do that. And then if you want to convert it further to a GPT disk, you can do that as well. Dynamic disk and GPT disk, your book covers those, so we're not going to go over that. Let's see, what else can we do? If you want to open this hard drive and get to the file system, you can just right click and select open, and that will take you to whatever spot the drive letter is assigned to. So you can see here that the root, or the very tip top level of the drive, is C, and from there we can go into any application here that we want to, or any folder that we want to. Same thing with right clicking and clicking Explore, it takes you to the exact same spot. If we want to change the drive letter and paths, we can do that. Now you have to be really careful though about changing drive letters, especially if it's the drive letter that contains your operating system, or if it has software installed on it. Because if you change the drive letter, a lot of software is set up so that a lot of software is set up so that it points to a specific drive letter. Now remember how I said drive letters are arbitrary because we can change them. Just because we can change them, we don't have to, or it doesn't mean we should. So since they reference that drive letter specifically, what do you think would happen if we changed it to, let's say, D? Well, it probably wouldn't work because it's referencing that C drive. So make sure that you, if you're changing the drive letter, you've kind of taken into account the fact that your applications may not work after you change it. So if we wanted to change it, we could click highlight the volume we want, click change, and it's similar to that menu we looked at before, we haven't got there yet. We can assign it a drive letter, and then we'd click OK. So just to go through this process, I have this unallocated disk right here. If I wanted to assign that a drive letter, and this happens typically like when you put in a new hard drive, or even a flash drive. Sometimes it's not formatted with a file system. You'll see it show up here as unallocated. So you can right click and click new simple volume, and then this was basically just setting it up as a basic disk, not a dynamic disk. You can specify how much storage you're going to use. So if you want to split it up into different partitions, you can do that. We'll click next. And then you can set up the F drive, or you can set it up as whatever whatever drive letter you'd like to. So I'm going to set it up as my M drive. Click next, and then it allows you to select which drive you're formatting, or which file system you're formatting. Now, if you've read the book, or after reading the book, you'll see the difference between, or you'll know the difference between FAT32 and NTFS. Typically, you'll see Windows drives formatted as NTFS just because it gives you a more robust feature set. The disadvantage, of course, is the fact that FAT is a little bit more universal, in the sense that you can plug a FAT32 formatted hard drive or flash drive into just about any other machine out there. So like Windows or Linux or Unix, and that machine should be able to read it. So it's a little bit more universal. So we're going to click File System, NTFS. We're going to leave everything else as default. We'll click Next, and we'll click Finish. And you can see here that our new volume has shown up up here. It's shown up as the M drive We got a prompt saying, hey, what do you want to do with this drive? It's like kind of how you plug a flash drive into it. It'll prompt you like this. And then from there, we can use this like a normal hard drive. And then just as proof of concept here, if we go to computer, we can see here that we have two drives listed under hard drives. We have a C drive and we have an M drive. And we can put things in the M drive and we can put things in the C drive. So that is basically disk management. Again, there's a whole bunch of different things you can do with it in terms of in terms of arranging your hard drives or arranging your volumes. But I just wanted to give you kind of a brief overview of what you could do with it. And let me back up here. Maybe we should look at just this really quick. So if we wanted to shrink a volume, so let's say we wanted to take up less space on this hard drive, we could shrink it. And this may take a little bit sometimes depending on the size of your hard drive. But let's say we want to make it so that there's like 200, well, let's say 2 gigabytes left over, or 2 gigabytes of free space on this drive. We're going to say 8,000 megabytes. And if you'll remember from CIS 120, 1,000 megabytes or 1,024 megabytes equals a gigabyte. So if we want to take up 8 gigabytes, then what we'll do is we will, excuse me. I gave it more. This is how much you want to shrink the volume by. So if we want to shrink the volume by, make it 8 gigabytes in size, and we want to shrink it by 2 gigabytes, then what we would do is we'd have to type 2,000 in here because 2,000 megabytes equals roughly 2 gigabytes. So we'll hit shrink. And now you can see here that we have a partition of 8 gigabytes, and we have a partition here of unallocated space of 2 gigabytes. So that's the shrink feature. If we wanted to delete a volume entirely, we could do that as well by just clicking delete volume. And then that will completely get rid of it. You can see we don't have it here. So that's disk management in a nutshell. We went over several different features of disk management. If you have the opportunity to set up a few different hard drives on your physical machine, definitely do that and play around with it and see what you can do with it. If you have a virtual environment, try creating a few different virtual hard drives and connecting them up to your virtual machine, and then play around with that too. And see what you can do as far as creating dynamic disks or span disks or span volume dynamic disks like span volumes and stripe volumes, and just play around with it and see if you and get comfortable with it. If you've set up your test environment like this, where it's kind of more of a sandbox, it shouldn't matter. If you mess anything up, you can always just rebuild. So that's kind of the advantage of having like a little virtual environment to work with. So enough about disk management here. So that's basically the disk management utility. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of that. I said that we would talk about disk cleanup. So let me show you one way to get there. I'm going to go ahead and we're going to click computer. And then we're going to right click our C drive. And we're going to click properties. And you can see that it takes us right back to that exact same properties window that we were looking at in disk management. Again, Microsoft includes a whole bunch of different ways for you to get to the same place. So we're going to click disk cleanup. And so what disk cleanup is going to do is it's going to go through your hard drive, and it might take a few minutes to complete. And what it's going to do is it's going to show you all of the different areas where you could save space on your hard drive. Now this is going to typically mean like emptying the recycle bin, emptying the temporary internet files. Sometimes there's log files that take up a lot of space, and so on and so forth. So you can see here that I have in my recycle bin 1500, or excuse me, 1500. I have 150. Wow, excuse me. I have 15.7 megabytes worth of data in my recycle bin, and if I remove that, I would save that much space. And in my temporary internet files here, you'd be surprised at how much data your computer caches on your local machine to make websites load faster. So you'll see in the temporary internet files here, sometimes that can get really, really, really big. So disk cleanup says here that I can use disk cleanup to free up approximately 21.3 gigabytes worth of space. So that's a pretty big chunk of data. Temporary files is another one that you can get rid of, and it will typically get pretty big because sometimes programs will store temporary information into that temp folder, and usually it deletes it, but sometimes it doesn't, so it'll have leftover info in there that you need to get rid of. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll just select, I'm going to unselect the 21 gigabytes because that might take a little bit to clean. We're just going to tell it to clean up my recycle bin. So you do that by just selecting which one you want. And then we'll click OK. And then it'll ask us if we permanently want to delete these files. So we have to make sure, before we do this, that these areas that we want to remove, we actually want to remove. So make sure you're going through those and double checking. You don't want to be that person that accidentally deletes someone's temp folder where they were accidentally storing things, like pictures and the like. So make sure that you look through those folders beforehand. So we're going to click delete files, and then that will go ahead and clear up a lot of space for us. So that's disk cleanup in a nutshell. It's pretty straightforward and easy utility to use. It just makes it simple for us to administer the computer and make sure that the hard drive isn't getting thrashed by old files, that sort of thing. So I mentioned I was going to show you the error checking and defragmentation option. So the error checking option is going to scan your hard drive for physical errors. I'm going to post a link in the discussion boards that is kind of more of a scientific look at how hard drives work. So it's totally worth the watch. And I think it surprised even me when I first watched it how little I knew about how the hard drive physically works. So go ahead and take a look at that. But the error checking will actually check the physical drive for defects and errors, and if it finds any, sometimes it can correct them, but other times it won't. So if you're running this check disk program and you're seeing it pop up with a whole bunch of errors, it'll say bad sector. Then you need to get ready to replace that hard drive. And typically disk management will start showing you errors on the hard drive. Remember how we were looking in disk management and it showed status of healthy? It'll probably show status of unhealthy if there's sector errors. So if we were to click check now, we can click start, and then you have two options here: automatically fix the file system for errors, and scan for and attempt recovery of bad sectors. So bad sectors are the physical locations on the hard drive that can go bad over time. Automatically fix the file system for errors. If this runs kind of like a separate check. If we're going to look at the command line here in a second, but if you use the command line to run a little program called SFC, or System File Checker, that effectively does the same thing. Basically what it does is it looks at the operating system files and it checks it for integrity. So in other words, it just makes sure that the files that are on your operating system are created or running like they should. So I'm going to uncheck that, and I'm going to check, scan, and attempt recovery bad sectors, and I'm going to hit start. And sometimes what will happen here is it will tell you that, hey, this hard disk is in use and you need to reboot your system in order to apply this. So you should be aware of the fact that can and probably will happen. So it'll prompt you asking you if you want to reboot. Typically what I like to do is if I'm going through and cleaning up a hard drive, I'll just plan to reboot the machine and run this program here. So it'll pop up this message afterwards, and it will tell you if it has problems. If it doesn't have problems, it'll say exactly what it says here: no problems were found. If it does have problems, it'll tell you here. And you can click this See Details drop down to see some more information. And I'm going to leave this, I'm going to close this here in a second, but when we go look at SFC/scan now, in the command line, the output of the command will be exactly what you see here. So I'm going to go ahead and close. Now defragment. So you probably done this a couple times if you've owned a Windows system, or any operating system for that matter. So basically what can happen is your hard drive will start to get fragmented. And what that means is it starts to store data physically on the hard drive in a location that's difficult for the operating system and the physical hard drive to reach quickly. So what you'll see is the system will start to slow down. Things will take a long time to load. So defragmenting basically is the process of taking those non-continuous files and then consolidating them down so they're all continuous physically on the hard drive. Again, in the video that I'm going to post, I think it will go over how files are physically written to a hard drive. So you'll kind of see what this defragmentation process is. But in a nutshell, it takes non-continuous files and then consolidates them so it's quicker. So the hard drive has a shorter amount of time to read the file. So if we click defragment now, you'll get a window that pops up like this. Now, by default, which is this is my favorite thing about Windows 7. I think Windows Vista had this too. But by default, there's a schedule that defrag runs on. So theoretically, your machine will never be super fragmented. It'll always run on this schedule, and you won't need to take time out of your day to actually run this defrag process. But if you want to run it manually, you can click Analyze Disk, and that will analyze your disk for fragmentation. If we click that, it'll take a little bit to run. Depending on the fragmentation of your hard drive, this can take a really long time. So if you're doing your lab and it's taking a while, when you go to do your lab, make sure you give yourself enough time, because sometimes this can take a while. I've seen it take upwards of like 2 or 3 hours, depending on how fragmented the hard drive is. So make sure you give yourself enough time to go through this process. So this is actually just going to create a report, and it's going to tell us how fragmented the hard drive is, and it will let us know if we need to defragment the hard drive. So I'm running on a solid state drive here, so it will I'm running on a traditional hard drive here, but if I was running on a solid state drive, it'll tell me here. Now, one thing I should caution you about, we were talking about disks and hard disks. If you have a solid state drive on your machine, you do not want to run disk defragmenter. Solid state drives they're a new technology. If you've ever heard of SSD, that stands for solid state drive. Basically what they are is they're just a faster form of storage, and the problem you run into is the way it's written to the actual solid state drive is much different than it's written on a physical hard drive, and you can destroy your SSD if you run this disk defragment process. So if you have a solid state drive, and you should consult with your manufacturer before doing this, don't run disk defragmenter. And the cool thing is Windows detects if you have a solid state drive, so it will turn disk defragmentation off for you if you do. But again, don't run disk defragmenter if you have a solid state drive. If you need to find out if you have a solid state drive, like I said, you can either consult your hardware vendor or your hardware manual that came with your computer, or you can go through that the disk management utility we looked at earlier. You can find the model number of your hard drive, which you'll do in your lab, and then you can Google that, and you can see if you have a solid state drive or a physical hard drive. So we can see here that the disk is 16% fragmented. We don't necessarily want it to have 16% fragmented, so we should probably run disk defragmentation. So you can see here that created the report for us, and at this point we want to run the defrag utility. So to do that, we click defragment disk. It would analyze it one more time, and then it would go through and start consolidating your data down into more manageable chunks that it could use. For now, I'm going to click Stop Operation because I don't want to go through this process, but that's essentially what you go through for disk defragmentation. You can configure your schedule too, so if you want to tell it when it should run, you can do that. And you can also tell it what disks you want it to run on. So if you've got multiple hard drives hooked up to your machine, you can select which hard disk it runs on at which time. One thing you should be aware of is that when you run the disk defragmentation process, it will slow down your machine a little bit. So I typically like to leave my computer on and then run it when I'm not sitting at my computer. So by default, it's set weekly on Wednesday nights at 1 a.m. But if we wanted to change that to daily, we could just select daily and then set the time. If we wanted to change it to monthly, we tell it which day of the month we want it to run, and then we set the time. I'd say I usually like to leave it at the default of weekly. Typically, you're not doing a whole lot of read-writes on a client machine, or you're not doing enough reading and writing on a client machine to justify having it any higher than that. So I like to do it about weekly. So we went through disk management, we talked about disk cleanup and some of the other utilities. Let's talk about the Microsoft Management Console. So the Microsoft Management Console, like we mentioned before, is just a customizable way for you to, or it's a customizable console. So by console, I mean it's an area that you can throw tools in to administer your computer. So let me show you how to get to it. First off, the easiest way to do it is to just type MMC, and you can see the first thing that pops up is mmc.exe. So we'll hit enter, then we'll say yes. And now this looks really similar to that computer management console we looked at earlier. So this is just a blank version of what we looked at. In a future lab, you're going to be going through and you're going to be setting up a custom management console. But I'm going to go through and I'll just show you how we could add that disk management utility that we looked at earlier to our console here. So you're going to be using MMCs a lot this term, so it's good to get familiarized with this. So first off, what we're going to do is we're going to right click and we're going to select what we're going to do is we're going to select add and remove snap-in from the file menu. You can get there by pressing Control M as well. I'm a more of a visual guy, so I like to do file and then add and remove snap-in. So a snap-in is basically just a utility that we can add to these Microsoft management consoles. So first off, what we want to do, I mentioned that I want to add that disk management utility. So in here, we have a snap-in for disk management. So if we want to add that utility to this management console we're looking at, we'll just select disk management. We'll select add. And then this is going to ask you what you want to manage. So the cool thing about MMCs is that you can manage your computer, or you can manage a computer on the network. For the purposes of this demo, I'm going to show you just this computer, but it's good to point out that you can manage other machines. So we'll hit finish. And then what we're going to do is we're going to, now that we've got the disk management added, we'll just go ahead and hit add. Or excuse me, we hit add. We're going to hit OK. And now we can see in the left-hand pane, we've got that disk management utility. If we click on it, we can see everything that we could see before by opening up disk management. So the advantage of this is that you can create custom management consoles that you could deploy to, let's say, a technician under your command, or you could use yourself if you find yourself using some more utilities over another. You can really customize this out exactly how you want to. And I mentioned in a future lab we're going to be delving a little bit further into this, but it's good to just kind of see how this management console works and what you can do with it. So that is just going through and adding the disk management utility to this Microsoft Management Console. And then if we wanted to save it and we wanted to use it for future reference, we could do that. So we're going to hit Save As. We're going to choose where we want to save it. Desktop selected. So I'm going to save it just right to the desktop, which is right back here. And I'm going to save it as Tim Console 1. We'll hit Save. And then we'll hit close. And you can see here that timconsole1.msc is saved right here. If I just double click this and click yes, it will take me right back to where I was. So hopefully that makes sense. These are some really, really useful tools that you can use as far as managing stuff in the graphical user interface, or GUI. So we'll close out of that. So that's how to launch and customize a management console. I think that's all you need to learn, or all you need to know to complete your lab. The last part of the lab, though, is going over the command line interface. So just a brief note about the command line interface. We'll bring it up here and then I'll talk about it. So the first way to get there is to just go to search and type CMD, and then that will that will show you cmd.exe. You'll be able to click that and then launch the command line. You can also get to the command line by clicking Start, and then, by clicking Start, All Programs. Then if we go to Accessories, we will have Command Prompt right here. So it's either you'll hear it Command Prompt or Command Line. I like to refer to it as CLI or Command Line Interface. One thing you should note: if you want to run an application, or the command prompt, or any application for that matter, as an administrator, which you'll probably need to do if you want to run that disk defragment utility, you right-click and select Run as Administrator. And that will run this program with escalated privileges as an administrator. And we'll talk about what privileges are in a future lab. So, we'll go back to this line, or to this section here, and I'll just talk a little bit briefly about what the command line is and why it's important. So, the command line is basically just the underlying part of the operating system. You've got all these really cool and pretty graphical user interface looking things here, like these pictures here, that you can click on, and then they do something. The command line is basically just the underlying part of that. So it's launching things without using the pretty pictures, so to speak. So, for example, we have, let's see here. We have Notepad, right? Notepad's basically just a text editor that we can use. Excuse me. That we can use for, text editing, adding notes, writing commands, that sort of thing. And to get to it, all we'd have to do is click All Programs, Accessories, and then you can see that there's Notepad right there. And it's just a picture that we click on, and it launches Notepad right up here, right? So what that command, or what that's actually doing, when you click Start and then click that icon there to launch Notepad, is it's launching notepad.exe, which is an executable. And so if we type notepad.exe into the command line and hit enter, it will do exactly the same thing as clicking that picture. So with that in mind, we can actually run a variety of different tools all via the command line. Now there's a few reasons you'd run it over the command line versus clicking the picture. One of the main reasons you'd use the command line is the fact that you can automate the command line, or you can automate commands that you'd run in the command line using different things like scripts and those sort of things. We're going to get into scripts a little bit later, but the command line also allows you to have access to all of the options that are available in an application. So it's really hard to fit a whole bunch of options, like hundreds of options, into a graphical user interface. So typically in a graphical user interface, or GUI, what they do is they include only the most used options, and then the less frequently used options they'll throw into the command line as switches, and we'll talk about switches here in a second. So in a nutshell, the command line's a little bit more powerful than using the GUI, and you can do a little bit more with the command line. So for this lab, for this module, we're going to be using the command line to run defrag on the hard drive on your computer. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go over how to do that, and then let's see here. yeah, I'm going to go over how to do that, and then I'm going to go over how to do a few of the other utilities we looked at in the GUI, but on the command line. Excuse me. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead, and I'm just going to explain what each one of these things is as I type it. So let's say I want to run that analysis report that I just ran in the defrag menu. But I want to run it from this command prompt here. So the first thing I do is I type defrag, so D-E-F-R-A-G, and that is the command. So that's the first thing you want to do is you want to type the command that you're trying to do. The next thing you want to do is you want to give it some parameters. So in this case, we're going to tell it which drive we want to defragment or run this process on. So to figure that out, we have to identify the drive letter, and we can do that just by going into the File Explorer here, or in other words, clicking Start and Computer and getting here. And then you can see that here that we have just the C drive that we can run the defrag utility on. So let's say we want to run the defrag utility on this specific drive, which is labeled as C. We would type C:, and then from there, we would type /A and then /V. So these slash and then the letter that we just typed, those are called command line flags or command line switches. And basically what that does is it tells the operating system that we want to run the defrag command a very specific way. So to figure out all the different switches that you have available to you, in any application you run on the command line, you can type /?, and then hit enter, and then that will show you all of the different command line flags that are available to you. So if we want to figure out what flags we have or switches we have available to us for the defrag command, we'll type DEFRAG / and then $. Then we'll hit enter. And now you can see here that this tells us some information. This is, in Linux terms, this is what's called a man page, or a manual page. And basically what this does is it tells us what the application is, the syntax or the way we need to write this application, and then what parameters or options we have available to us. And then sometimes they'll give you helpful little examples down here. So we can see here that if we wanted to run the analysis of the volume that we're trying to defrag, we would have to type /A, because the description here says perform analysis on the specified volumes. And then the -V option says print verbose output containing the fragmentation statistics. In other words, that's telling us that we want to print the output of the command in such a way that it gives us kind of like a nice little report. So what we're going to do is we're going to run defrag C /A /V. Now sometimes they're case sensitive. In this case, I believe they are, so we're going to do /A space /V. It's really important also you make sure you have the spaces in there too, because if you don't have the spaces in between your parameters, the command won't run. So make sure that you're spacing them out. So we're going to hit enter. That's going to run the disk defragmenter, and this is one thing I wanted to show you here, and this is why I talked about administrative privileges. You can see here that the disk defragmenter cannot start because you have insufficient privileges to perform this operation. I asked last week in the discussion board why you need administrator rights to your computer. This is one of the reasons why. So we're going. All right, so now we're over here on the administrator account, and now that we have the proper access via the administrator account, we're going to go ahead and rerun this defrag tool that we were trying to run on my local account. So first we're going to type defrag, and then we're going to type the volume name, followed by the two command line switches that we want to use, which are V and A. And I'm going to go ahead and hit enter on this, and I just want to show you what the output looks like. So once we hit enter, this defragmenter will start to run, and then you can see on here that it's going to go through its whole process of running the disk defragmentation tool. Now, eventually, there's going to be a whole bunch of output that's going to happen, and it's going to give you a fairly robust report, as you'll see when you do your lab. The first thing that I'm going to go ahead and cancel this, and this is probably another useful command line tool that we can run. I'm just going to hit Control and C on my keyboard all at the same time, and then that's going to go ahead and cancel the operation. So that's one of those things that you can do if, like, let's say a command hung or it's taking too long, as in the case of this video. You can press Control C on your keyboard and then you can cancel the command. So that's kind of what it looks like when you run the disk defragmenting, the disk defrag tool with just the normal options that we have going on here. This is how you would normally run it if you're just trying to issue the command and you're going to leave this command line open while it runs. But let's say you want to log what's going on. So if we want to log what's going on, we need to tell the output of this file to go somewhere. So the way we do that is we use this little caret symbol. And we're going to go ahead and do that. And it's basically going to say that everything that is generated, or all the text that's generated on the command line interface from the left-hand side of from the left-hand command, we need to take that and then put it somewhere. So the way that we do that is we specify the location that we want to put this. So before we get too far into that, I kind of want to talk about how Windows works as far as the file structure, the file and folder structure goes. So it's very hierarchical, meaning that there's a top level folder and then there's a whole bunch of subfolders underneath it. So we're going to go ahead and launch Windows Explorer here. We'll click C. And you can see here that the C drive, this is C is the very root of the drive that we're working with, or the very top tip level of the hard drive that we're working with. If we want to go down below that, let's say we want to go into this users folder, we just double click that and now we're C users. So, and then if we want to take it one level further, we could go C users and then T green, and then we're 3 levels deep. So essentially what you've got, and I'm going to use the text editor over here, we'll bring it up over here. Essentially what you've got is you've got a very high level folder, we'll call it C, and then underneath that you've got a few subfolders. So in this case we have the users folder, we had, what was there? We had Windows, and so on and so forth. And then underneath each one of those folders, we have other folders as well. So T green would be one, and so on and so forth. And this can continue on for as many folders as you'd like. There's a maximum file path, but typically you don't ever hit that. Character limit in the file path, but typically you don't ever hit that. So it's very much a hierarchy, and if we want to specify the location in which we want to store the output of this command, we need to sort of understand how Windows saves it. And an easy way to issue the command an easy way to figure out what the file path is just to navigate to whatever folder you want to save it in. So in this case, let's say I want to save this into my, we'll save it into my T green users folder. So we'll click C, users, T green, and then desktop. Let's say I want to save that right on the desktop. All I'd have to do is click the top URL bar here, and then that would give me the actual file path. And so I could do one of two things here. I could just come over here and I could type that whole file path, which was C users T green desktop. Or an easier way to do it would just be to click up here, then right click and select copy, and then come back over here and right click one more time and select paste, and that will paste that file path there. So we've given it the file path. Now we need to also specify the name of the text file that we're going to create. So in your lab, it's going to be called lab2a.txt. And the way you specify that is lab2 is just typing lab2a, which will be the name of the file, and then .txt. Now the .txt is the file extension, and that tells you what type of application is going to run this, or is going to open this file. And by default in Windows, .txt files are opened with Notepad, and we'll talk about file extensions and file associations a little bit later. But for right now, all you need to know is that this this command, the output that we saw here, instead of showing up on the screen, is going to be redirected into this text file. So just to show you what I mean here, I've got the exact file path of where I want this to be saved, and you can see here that there's nothing in here aside from the console we created earlier. So I'm going to hit enter, and now you can see here that this text file is created. Now while the command runs, your command line is going to be unusable, so at least for right now. The command is running, and you can see here that the cursor is blank. I'm trying to type, but I can't type anything into it, and that's because the command is running. So once the command finishes, it will drop you back at the command line, and then you'll be able to use the command line again. So you can see here that the defrag command ran, and now we have a text file that we can look at later. So I'll show you the output of the text file. And this is what you'll see. This is an important text file for your lab. You'll see the analysis report that it gives. Now, this is a good example of how you can see that how you can see the power of the command line. This report is much more robust than what we got in the graphical user interface version when we ran the analysis earlier in the video. So you can see here that if you're a manager, or maybe you need to hand something off to your manager here, as far as like the disk defragmentation report, this will be a much better option to use, just because it's more verbose than it would be to use to just like maybe take a screenshot of the graphical user interface. So that's just a brief example of how to run that defrag command that you'll be running in your lab, and the output that you'll get in your lab. So you're going to use these, and you're going to do a little bit of thinking and compare the analysis report you get prior to running the defrag to the analysis report you get after you run the defrag. So we're going to go ahead and close out of that. So that's defrag. Oh, sorry. And we also said that we were going to look at two other commands, checkdisk and convert. So earlier in the video I showed you how to run the checkdisk command, and the checkdisk command again is a command that you can use to basically just check the integrity of the disk, and this is checking actually the physical hard disk for defects and errors and spots that it can't write to. So this is exactly, we'll go ahead and run the command here. So checkdisk is chkdsk. Now that's a little bit less intuitive, I think, of a command than defrag would be, but as you play with Windows more, you'll get to learn the commands, and it'll become easier and easier to remember what they are. So off the top of my head, I don't remember how to run this command, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that parameter we looked at earlier, or the flag we looked at earlier, which was /?, and that's going to show us how we can run this command. So we can see here that the syntax for it, and this is a little bit less pretty, I think, than the defrag manual page is, but you can see here that you have to run, or the syntax of the command is checkdisk, and then you give it the volume name, or the file path name, or the file name, depending on what you're trying to do. Now you can look at these parameters, and you can see that you have the option of checking a volume, or checking a file path, or checking a file name, and depending on what you're trying to check, you'll use a different set of these flags here. So what we're going to do is we just want to check to see if the C drive, which in this case is a 90 gigabyte physical hard drive, is if it has any errors. So we'll run chkdsk, and then we'll say C, and this is very similar to how that defrag command was run. Now what we can do here is we can tell it to fix the errors, or we can just tell it we can just tell it to fix the errors by using this -f command. Or if we want to just run check disk on C and get a report of what we were looking at, we can do that just by running this command. This command as it stands. So what we're going to do here, you can see we've got a few other options. Typically what you'll do for this command is you'll run check disk on the specific drive or volume that you want to run the check disk on, and then you'll type /F, and then that will fix errors if it can. And if it can't, it will tell you, and it'll tell you that there's bad sectors. Typically, if it comes back with sort of a negative report that says, hey, there's some bad sectors going on here, or the hard drive's not working like it should, it's probably about time to replace the drive. But if it comes back clean, or if it's fixed the errors that it did find, then you should be good to use that drive as long as you can. So I'm going to just show you how it looks as you're running the check disk command. We'll go ahead and do that. And so here's an interesting thing. If you're trying to run this check disk command on a drive that you're currently using, and we can tell that we're currently using this drive because Windows is installed on it and all of the operating system files are running on it, so it's in use, quote unquote. It's going to ask you if you want to schedule a time to run to run check disk, and if you hit yes, you can do that. If you hit no, check disk will end. So I'm going to hit no for now, but if I were to say yes, the next time the system restarted, we would be able to check disk would launch automatically as the system starts. So that's the check disk command. And again, you'd run that if you just wanted to check your hard drive for integrity errors or physical defects of the drive. So the last thing that we're going to go over is we're going to talk about the convert command. Now, we didn't look at a way to convert file systems in the GUI, so I'm going to show you that really quick. So let's say you got a flash drive plugged in to your machine, and let me go back to disk management here. We'll go the other way since we went the disk management route the first time. So let's say we've got a flash drive, and where are you? Oh, I already have it mounted as F. I can't do that. Bear with me for just a moment here. I'm so sorry. Change that. This is a good lesson, I suppose. You can't map two locations to the exact same drive letter. So you can see here that I have this folder or this network share that's being mapped as F, and I don't want it to be, and I want to be using F for this 1 gigabyte disk that I'm going to be adding. So if there's a conflict, either neither of them will get mapped, or if it's mapped already, you'll just run into errors where it just won't show up for you. So what we're going to do is we're going to reassign this to Y because we can see it's not in use. We're going to click OK. That was X. Excuse me. Y. Click OK. You see we got an error there if we since we already have X mounted. So that will pop up and alert you saying, hey, you can't do this. So I'm going to say yes, and we'll see that this new volume showed up for us in the computer console here. So now what I want to do is, let's say this is a flash drive I plugged in, and I really want to share files between a Linux machine and my Windows machine, and I want to format this as FAT32. All we have to do is right-click the volume, then we'll click Format, and then where it says File System here, we'll select FAT32. We've also got a couple other options in here. I typically leave these as default. You can label the volume, so if this is a flash drive, I don't know, I might name it Flash Drive 1, and then, or I might just name it Flash Drive, excuse me. And then if I want to do a quick format, which is just going to quickly go over the disk and format it to the FAT32 file system, we'll just leave that checked. I typically like to leave that checked. Then we'll hit Start. It's going to warn you that formatting it will erase all data on the disk. So make sure that when you do this format process, you have your data backed up, because it's going to remove everything. And this is especially important for the command line version of this, because we won't have the same warning pop up. It's just going to do it. So just make sure that, anytime you're messing with file systems or changing the way that a disk works, back it up. So we're going to go ahead and click OK. We'll click OK. And now we can see here, if we look at the properties of the flash drive, that the file system is FAT32. So that's how to do it in the GUI. And that's pretty straightforward, and I usually like to stick that way. But sometimes you need to run the convert from the command line. So to do that, we're just going to go back over here to the command line, and we're going to go convert. And I'm going to say question mark because I want to take a look at that manual page again. And we'll go ahead and scroll down. And you can see here, this has a description. It says converts a FAT volume to NTFS. So if we wanted to convert this FAT volume to NTFS, we can do that with convert. So we're going to say convert. And then it says volume here, so we want to specify which volume we want to convert. So we're going to say Y. And then I think, let's see here, we also want to say V, or dash V. Oh, excuse me, I missed a step here. So you see here that the next step is to tell it which file system we want to convert it to. And I'm going to go back here and just for the sake of doing the same thing, I'm going to convert this back to, I'm going to format this back to NTFS. Just so we can do proof of concept here. So if we hit properties, we can see, of course, that the file system is NTFS. So what I'm going to do here first is I'm going to do convert Y, which again is the Y drive there. And then I'm going to do dash and then FS, which is the syntax of this command. And then we're going to say, let's go ahead and say, oops, excuse me. I messed up there. I wanted to go the other way around. Bear with me for a moment, please. So sorry, we're back at FAT32. So now we want to convert this drive to NTFS. Say NTFS. I don't think it's case sensitive, but I usually like to follow the syntax of the command. So then we're going to type /v for verbose, which is verbose specified content that will be run in verbose mode. Again, typically /v in most commands is verbose, and that expands the amount of information that it gives you. So then we're going to hit enter, and then we want to give it a. It's going to ask us for a current volume label for the Y drive. So I'm just going to hit enter. Oop. Let's try it one more time. And that's asking us to input a volume label, and that was that flash drive command we entered there. So now we're going to go ahead, and you can see here that it's gone through and it's verified the files and folders. It's gone through and done its thing, and now we're going to go over and we're going to do a refresh on this page here. We're going to say properties, and now we can see that it's formatted back to NTFS. So we were at FAT32, and now we're back to NTFS. So I hope that all makes sense for you. That was all I wanted to show you this evening, That was all I wanted to show you in this video. If you have any questions about what you've seen, please go ahead and post in the discussion boards. And then good luck on doing your labs. This one's a lot of fun, I think, and I hope you learn a lot. Thanks.